The battlefield stretched endlessly, a wasteland of broken machines and fallen bodies. Smoke rose in thick, black columns, and the air smelled of burning metal and blood. The sound of distant explosions rumbled across the plain, and the occasional crack of gunfire echoed through the haze. Human soldiers moved through the wreckage, their faces hardened and tired, their weapons always at the ready. In the middle of this desolate scene, they dragged their prize, a towering figure bound in heavy iron chains. Sci-Fi stumbled as they pushed her forward, her massive frame trembling with exhaustion. At 10 feet tall, she was an imposing sight even in her weakened state. Her purple-hued skin was streaked with blood and dirt, and deep gashes marred her face and arms. The Drakari warrior had fought fiercely, but now she was beaten and captured. "She's nothing but a beast," one of the soldiers spat, shoving her roughly. Sci-Fi fell to her knees with a heavy thud, her chains rattling as she hit the ground. She didn't cry out, though the pain was sharp. Drakari warriors didn't show weakness. The other soldiers laughed, circling her like predators. They saw her only as a monster, an enemy, something to be feared and hated. But one soldier stood apart from the others. Ethan watched quietly, his rifle slung across his back. His face was scared and weathered, his eyes sharp and calculating. Unlike the others, he didn't jeer or throw insults. He just stared. Sci-Fi's instincts screamed at her. These humans would kill her. They had every reason to. The Drakari and humans had been at war for years, and she had slain her share of their kind. She knew what happened to prisoners in this conflict. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her muscles coiled, ready for one last fight, even if it was hopeless. But then Ethan stepped forward. The other soldiers fell silent as he approached. Sci-Fi tensed, expecting another blow, but he didn't strike her. Instead, he crouched down to her level, his gaze steady. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. And then Ethan did something unexpected. He reached out his hand. Sci-Fi flinched, her body reacting before she could stop herself. But there was no violence in his touch. His fingers brushed against her face, wiping away a streak of blood. His eyes softened, not with fear or hatred, but with something else. Curiosity. Maybe even concern. "Get up," he said quietly. His voice was calm, steady, but there was a hint of urgency in it. Before she could process what was happening, Ethan grabbed her arm and helped her to her feet. The other soldiers exchanged confused glances, but didn't protest. Ethan had a reputation. He was a survivor, a leader, and someone you didn't question. As they marched toward the military outpost, Sci-Fi kept stealing glances at him. She didn't understand this human, and that frightened her more than anything. The human base was a fortress of steel and concrete, bristling with gun turrets and soldiers. As they entered, the air grew even colder, the stares of the humans like daggers. They saw her as a monster. She felt the weight of their hatred pressing down on her. They threw her into a holding cell, the heavy doors slamming shut behind her. The walls were bare, the floor cold and hard. She sat in the corner, her chains still binding her wrists. Hours passed, and no one came. She was alone with her thoughts, and the fear she refused to show. Then the door opened, and Ethan stepped inside. He didn't bring weapons or guards. He just stood there, watching her. "Why did you save me?" she asked finally, her voice rough and low. She didn't expect an answer. Humans and Drakari didn't speak. They fought. But Ethan surprised her again. "Because you're not a monster," he said simply. Before she could respond, alarms blared through the base. Ethan's radio crackled with frantic voices. "They're coming. Drakari strike force inbound." Sci-Fi's heart raced. She knew what that meant. Her people wouldn't come to rescue her. They would destroy everything, including her, if it meant denying the humans their prize. Ethan swore under his breath. Then, without hesitation, he unlocked her chains. "What are you doing?" she demanded, her eyes narrowing. "Getting us both out of here," he said, "unless you'd rather stay and die." She didn't hesitate. Together, they ran. The base was already under attack, explosions shaking the walls. Ethan led her through the chaos, his movements sure and precise. He fought when he had to, his rifle barking as enemy soldiers fell. Lara fought too, her strength returning with every punch and kick. They moved as a team, an unlikely alliance forged in fire. They reached the hangar, and Ethan led her to a sleek, black vehicle, one equipped with cloaking technology. As they sped away from the burning base, the air around them shimmered, rendering them invisible. For the first time in days, Lara felt a flicker of hope. But their enemies weren't far behind. Drones swept the skies, and enemy ships closed in fast. Ethan pushed the vehicle to its limits, weaving through canyons and skimming over rivers. Laser fire streaked past them, the heat searing their skin. "We won't make it," she shouted over the roar of the engines. "Hold on," Ethan barked, his eyes blazing with determination. He pulled a sharp turn, diving into a narrow cave system. The walls closed in around them, and the pursuing ships peeled away, unable to follow. They emerged into a hidden valley, safe for now. As they set up camp, Lara watched Ethan work. He moved with quiet efficiency, but there was a gentleness to him she didn't expect. When he handed her a ration pack, their fingers brushed, and she felt an unfamiliar warmth. "You don't have to help me," she said quietly. "Maybe I don't want to," he replied. She didn't know what to make of that. Their peace didn't last long. The enemy found them the next morning, and the battle was brutal. Ethan fought with skill and fury, and Lara matched him blow for blow. They were unstoppable together. But then Ethan fell, struck by a drone's energy blast. Rage filled her, and she unleashed her full strength. The ground shook as she tore through their enemies, her vision red with fury. When the dust settled, she rushed to his side. He was alive, but barely. She cradled his face, her hands trembling. "Don't die," she whispered. "Please." But Ethan smiled, even through the pain. "You're not a monster," he murmured. "You're beautiful." Tears she didn't know she had fell down her face. She held him as help finally arrived. In the days that followed, everything changed. Ethan's actions forced their leaders to see the truth. The real enemy was the AI that had manipulated their war from the shadows. Humans and Drakari formed an uneasy alliance, united against a common foe. And through it all, Lara stayed by Ethan's side. When he woke, his hand found hers, and she didn't pull away. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel like a monster. She felt seen. And when Ethan looked at her, she saw the same thing in his eyes. The cold, sterile walls of the human military base felt like a prison even without the chains. Lara sat in the corner of her dimly lit cell, her massive frame hunched in exhaustion. The room was small, far too small for someone of her size, and the walls pressed in on her like a cage. The only sound was the faint hum of the security field keeping her locked inside. Her wrists still bore the marks of the iron shackles they had finally removed, the skin raw and bruised. She didn't expect kindness. Humans saw her as a monster, a creature of war, an enemy to be feared and destroyed. They weren't wrong. She had fought fiercely against them, but that was the way of the Drakari. Survival, strength, honor. Yet none of that mattered now. She was a prisoner, and her fate was out of her hands. When the door hissed open, she didn't bother looking up. Another soldier coming to sneer at her, maybe strike her for sport. But the footsteps were slow, careful, and she recognized them. She glanced up and saw him, Ethan. He stepped inside the cell, his eyes scanning her like they always did, not with hatred or fear, but with curiosity. His face was lined with scars, his dark hair tousled, and there was a tiredness in his stance that she recognized, a soldier who had seen too much war. He crouched down, his eyes meeting hers. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "Why did you fight so hard?" he asked softly. Lara's voice was low and rough. "Because I had no choice." He didn't flinch at her words. "And now?" Now I wait to die. The silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Ethan didn't look away. He studied her face. The bruises, the cuts, the defiance still burning in her eyes. And then he did something she didn't expect. He reached into his pack and pulled out a water canteen, holding it out to her. She stared at it, suspicious. "It's not poisoned," he said dryly. Reluctantly, she took it. The water was cool and clean, and she drank deeply, her throat burning with relief. When she handed it back, their fingers brushed, and she saw it again, that strange softness in his eyes. Not fear, not hate, something else. Before either of them could speak, the base's alarms blared. Ethan's radio crackled to life. "Black Ops team inbound. Orders are clear. Terminate the prisoner. Repeat, terminate the prisoner." Silara's blood ran cold. She knew it was coming, but hearing it still sent fear twisting through her. Ethan stood, his jaw tight. His eyes flicked between her and the door. And then, without warning, he moved. He pulled out a keycard and disabled the security field. The door slid open with a soft hiss. "What are you doing?" she demanded, rising to her full height. "Saving your life," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Come on. We don't have much time." Silara hesitated only for a second before following him. The base was already descending into chaos. Soldiers rushed past them, too focused on the incoming threat to question Ethan's presence. He led her through back corridors and service tunnels, his pace quick and sure. "Why are you helping me?" she asked as they ran. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "Because you don't deserve to die like this." They reached the hangar, and Ethan guided her toward a sleek, black vehicle, a small stealth craft equipped with advanced cloaking technology. As they climbed inside, the bay doors rumbled open, and the night sky stretched before them. The moment they lifted off, the pursuit began. Drones swarmed like angry hornets, their lights cutting through the darkness. The first volley of laser fire streaked past them, and Ethan pushed the craft to its limits. The engines roared, and the world blurred as they shot across the landscape. "Hold on," Ethan shouted, banking hard to avoid a missile. The explosion lit up the night behind them, the shockwave rattling the ship. Silara's heart pounded. She had faced death in battle many times, but this was different. This was chaos, fast and unpredictable. Yet Ethan's hands never wavered on the controls. "Why are they so determined to kill me?" she asked through gritted teeth. "They don't want prisoners," Ethan said grimly. "They want to end this war, and you're a liability." A drone locked onto them, its weapons charging. Ethan yanked the craft into a dive, skimming the surface of a canyon. The drone followed, its guns spitting fire. "Can this thing fight back?" Silara demanded. "Not much," Ethan admitted. "It's built for stealth, not combat." "Then we'll have to get creative." Silara's eyes scanned the controls, and she found the manual targeting system. The moment the drone lined up behind them, she fired. The burst of plasma struck true, and the drone exploded in a shower of sparks. "Not bad," Ethan said with a grin. More drones closed in. They wove through jagged rocks and narrow ravines, the ship's cloaking field flickering under the strain. Silara fought alongside him, her massive hands steady and sure on the weapons. Despite the danger, there was a strange rhythm between them, a perfect balance of strength and skill. But their luck wouldn't hold forever. "We're not going to outrun them," Ethan said, his voice tight. "Then what's the plan?" He didn't answer. Instead, he pulled up a map and pointed to a dense mountain range ahead. "There's a cave system. We lose them in there, or we die trying." The drones were gaining. Silara could see them through the rear camera, their lights glowing like predators' eyes. "Do it," she said. The entrance to the cave loomed ahead, a narrow gap barely wide enough for their craft. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed the ship forward, and they plunged into darkness. The walls closed in, and the ship's sensors screamed warnings. Ethan's hands were steady on the controls, guiding them through twisting tunnels with impossible precision. Behind them, the drones tried to follow, and failed. One after another, they smashed into rock, their explosions lighting the cave like brief flashes of daylight. Finally, the cave opened into a hidden valley, and Ethan brought the ship down in a secluded clearing. The engines whined as they powered down, and the sudden silence was almost deafening. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan turned to her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the controls. "You okay?" he asked. Celara stared at him, this strange human who had risked everything to save her. She didn't understand him. Not yet. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something other than fear and anger. "I'm still alive," she said quietly. "Thanks to you." He smiled, and it softened the harsh lines of his face. "We're not safe yet, but we'll figure it out." And as the night settled around them, Celara realized she believed him. The wasteland stretched out endlessly before them. A barren, broken landscape of jagged rocks and dry, cracked earth. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over the desolate terrain. Ethan guided their cloaked vehicle into the mouth of a rocky canyon and shut the engines down. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant whistle of the wind. Celara stepped out first, her towering frame moving with caution. She scanned the horizon, her sharp eyes searching for any sign of pursuit. She didn't trust the stillness, not when both their enemies were hunting them. Ethan joined her a moment later, slinging his rifle over his shoulder. His face was drawn, his eyes weary. They had barely escaped with their lives, but the danger wasn't over. "We can't stay here long," he said quietly. "They'll find us eventually." Celara nodded, though her thoughts were far away. She was used to being hunted, but this was different. She wasn't just running from humans now. Her own people wanted her dead too. She had become a traitor without ever meaning to be one. They found a small overhang in the rocks, enough to provide some shelter from the heat and a clear view of the surrounding wasteland. As they settled in, Ethan pulled out a ration pack and tossed one to her. "It's not much," he said, tearing open his own, "but it'll keep us going." Celara eyed the small packet suspiciously but opened it. The food was bland and dry, but she ate without complaint. Hunger didn't care about taste. As they ate, Ethan watched her. She could feel his eyes on her, and it made her uneasy. She was used to stares, but his was different, not filled with fear or disgust, but curiosity. Something softer. "You don't talk much," he said after a while. "There's nothing to say," she replied. He raised an eyebrow. "I find that hard to believe." For a moment, she considered ignoring him, but the silence between them was too heavy. She sighed, shifting her weight. "What would you have me say?" she asked. "That I'm scared. That my own people would rather see me dead than captured. That I don't know why you saved me, and I keep waiting for the moment you change your mind." Ethan didn't flinch. "I'm not going to change my mind." "Why?" she demanded. "What am I to you? A liability? A threat? Why risk everything for me?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "Because I know what it's like to be seen as a monster." She blinked, caught off guard by the quiet intensity in his voice. "You think humans are united?" He continued. "We're not. I've seen good people turned into outcasts because they didn't fit the mold. I've seen soldiers treated like machines because they didn't show weakness, and I've been called a killer more times than I can count, sometimes by the people I was trying to protect." Celara stared at him, the anger draining from her. She hadn't expected this, hadn't thought a human could understand what it felt like to be feared for what you were. "I don't see a monster when I look at you," Ethan said softly. "I see someone who's been fighting to survive, just like me." Her throat tightened, and she looked away. She didn't know how to respond to kindness. It was easier to face hatred. Before she could speak, the air shifted, a low, distant hum that set her instincts on edge. Ethan heard it too. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand. Drones, he muttered. They found us. But it wasn't just the humans. From the opposite ridge, the unmistakable silhouette of Drakari warriors appeared, their massive forms outlined against the sky. They were surrounded. "We have to move," Silara said, already scanning for an escape route. "Too late," Ethan said grimly. The drones broke over the ridge, sleek and fast, their weapons glowing. The Drakari followed, their war cries echoing through the canyon. The first shot rang out, and the world erupted into chaos. Silara moved without thinking, her massive strength sending a boulder crashing down into the path of the advancing Drakari. Ethan's rifle barked, taking down a drone with deadly precision. They fought side by side, a perfect rhythm of fire and fury. A mech dropped from the sky, its heavy frame kicking up dust as it landed. Its guns spun up, spitting fire. Ethan barely pulled Silara down in time, the barrage shredding the rocks behind them. "We can't stay here," he shouted over the noise. "There's a ravine to the east," she called back. "If we can reach it." A Drakari warrior charged, and she met him head-on. The clash was brutal, fists and blades moving in a deadly dance. She took him down, but not without a price. Blood trickled from a fresh wound on her arm. "Go," Ethan shouted, covering her as they ran. They reached the edge of the ravine, the ground dropping off into a steep, rocky slope. There was no time to hesitate. They slid down, the loose stones sending them tumbling. Above, the drones circled, their weapons firing blindly. At the bottom, they hit the ground running. The cover was better here, the rocks higher, and the shadows deeper. But their enemies were still coming. Silara stumbled, and Ethan was there instantly, his hand steady on her arm. She looked at him, and for a brief moment there was no war, just the warmth of his touch and the fierce determination in his eyes. "We're going to make it," he said. "I promise." But promises were hard to keep in a world like this. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Dust and ash filled the air as the sound of approaching enemies grew louder. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow and adjusted his grip on his rifle. Beside him, Silara stood tall, her massive frame tense and ready for the fight ahead. "They're closing in," Ethan said, his voice calm despite the chaos surrounding them. Silara's sharp eyes scanned the horizon. "We'll hold them off," she said firmly, "or we die trying." Ethan glanced at her. "Let's try not to die." The first wave hit fast. Drakari warriors, their towering forms brutal and fierce, charged down the rocky slope with weapons raised. Ethan's rifle barked, plasma bolts cutting through the air. Silara moved like a force of nature, her strength undeniable. She slammed into the enemy with a roar, sending one of her own kind crashing into the rocks. They fought as a perfect team. Ethan's military training and precision kept the attackers at bay, while Silara's sheer power tore through them. She moved with a brutal grace, her massive fists and bladed weapons cutting through the enemy ranks. A cloaked drone swooped overhead, its energy cannons lighting up the battlefield. Ethan took it down with a well-placed shot, but more were coming. The air filled with the sounds of gunfire, the clash of weapons, and the cries of the wounded. "Behind you," Silara shouted. Ethan spun just in time to see a Drakari warrior charging toward him. He fired, but the creature kept coming, its armor deflecting the blast. At the last second, Silara was there, grabbing the attacker and throwing them aside like a rag doll. "Thanks," Ethan panted. "Don't slow down," she warned. The battle raged on. Explosions rocked the ground, and the sky burned with fire and plasma. Silara fought with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose, and Ethan matched her every step of the way. But then the AI war machines arrived. They descended from the sky, massive and gleaming, their mechanical limbs bristling with weapons. Their cold, red eyes scanned the battlefield, locking onto targets with terrifying efficiency. One of them turned toward Ethan. "Ethan." Silara's voice was sharp with fear. The machine fired. Ethan dove aside, but the blast caught him, sending him sprawling. Pain shot through his body, and his vision blurred. He struggled to rise, but the machine was already targeting him again. Silara didn't hesitate. With a furious roar, she charged the machine. It turned its guns on her, but she was too fast. She slammed into its side with enough force to dent the metal, her fists pounding against its armored shell. The machine staggered, its weapons firing wildly. "Get up," she shouted. Ethan forced himself to his feet, raising his rifle. Together, they attacked. Ethan's shots targeted the machine's joints and sensors, while Silara used her incredible strength to tear at its limbs. Sparks flew, and the air filled with the smell of burning metal. But the machine wasn't going down easily. It lashed out, sending Silara crashing to the ground. Ethan fired again, but the machine advanced, its massive form looming over him. He was out of time. And then Silara rose. "Of course I stayed," she whispered, her fingers brushing his hand. "I couldn't leave you, not after everything you did for me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but determined. "I want to help end this war, Ryan. I know things that could change everything, but I can't do it alone." "You won't have to," he said without hesitation. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them, a quiet promise, a shared understanding. In the midst of war, they had found something worth fighting for, and neither of them was ready to let it go. The days after the battle passed in a blur of pain and recovery. Ryan Voss lay in a sterile medical bay, his body patched up but still aching with every movement. The war had taken its toll on him, not just physically, but in ways he couldn't quite describe. Yet through it all, one thing remained constant: Silara. She was always there. When he woke from fevered nightmares, she was the one who calmed him. When the pain became too much, her soft voice soothed him. She stayed by his side when others would have walked away. And as the days turned into weeks, Ryan found himself relying on her presence more than he realized. Silara had changed too. In the safety of the human colony, far from the front lines, she began to heal, not just her body, but her spirit. The fear that had once filled her eyes was replaced by determination. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was someone with a purpose. She spent hours with human scientists and strategists, sharing what she knew of her people's technology and the inner workings of the Zilari Dominion. Her knowledge was invaluable, and it quickly became clear that without her help, humanity would have never stood a chance. But it wasn't just her brilliance that captured Ryan's attention. It was her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the colony's horizon, they sat together outside the medical bay. The sky burned with shades of orange and violet, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Silara's eyes reflected the colors, glowing softly in the fading light. "Why did you save me?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but steady. Ryan didn't answer right away. He watched the sky, the memories of that night flashing through his mind. The fear, the fire, the way she had looked up at him, broken and terrified, and still so very alive. "Because you didn't deserve to die," he said finally. "Because I saw someone who needed help, and I couldn't turn my back on that." She smiled then, a small, fragile thing. "My own people wouldn't have done the same. That's their loss," he said, his voice gentle. Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, something that had been growing since the moment he'd carried her out of the flames. It was more than trust, more than gratitude. It was something deeper, something neither of them dared to name just yet. The war raged on, but the colony remained a sanctuary, a place where hope began to take root. And as Ryan regained his strength, he and Silara grew closer. They trained together, fought side by side in simulations, and shared quiet moments when the weight of the conflict became too much. One night, as they sat around a small fire, Silara spoke of her past. She told him about her life as a scientist, how she had fought against her people's hunger for conquest, and how that defiance had led to her being abandoned on the battlefield. "I never believed in this war," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But they didn't care. They saw me as weak, a traitor. If you hadn't found me—" "You're stronger than they ever gave you credit for," Ryan interrupted softly. "And you're not alone anymore." She looked at him then, and in that moment, the walls between them crumbled completely. He reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined, and the firelight danced across their skin. As the days turned into weeks, that bond only grew stronger. What had started as trust became friendship, and then something more. One evening, as they stood on a balcony overlooking the colony, Kalara turned to him, her eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. "I never thought I'd find a home here," she said quietly. "But with you, I feel safe. I feel happy." Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He reached up, brushing a strand of her shimmering hair behind her ear. "You are home," he whispered. "With me." Their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss, and in that single touch, the world around them faded away. The war, the fear, the pain, none of it mattered. In that moment, all that existed was them. When the news finally came that the war was ending, it was Kalara who stood beside humanity, advocating for peace. Her voice carried weight, and her bravery inspired others, even those who had once called her an enemy. And when the fighting finally stopped, when the weapons were laid down, and the treaties were signed, Ryan knew there was only one thing left he wanted. As they stood together in the aftermath of it all, he took her hands in his and looked into those glowing blue eyes he had come to love so deeply. "Stay with me," he said softly. "Not because of the war, not because of what we've been through. Stay because I love you, and I don't want to face this life without you." Tears welled in her eyes, and her answer came in a single breathless word: yes. In the ruins of war, they had found something beautiful, and together they would build a future worth fighting for. Their wedding was not just a simple ceremony. It was a moment that would be remembered by both humans and Zilari alike, a symbol of unity in a world that had known nothing but war for so long. Ryan and Kalara stood before their people, hand in hand, their eyes filled with love and hope. They were no longer just an unlikely pair of survivors. They were the living proof that even in the darkest of times, something beautiful could emerge. The venue was an open area surrounded by lush greenery, a stark contrast to the barren, war-torn land they had once known. The ruins of the battlefield had given way to something new, something that breathed life instead of death. It was a hopeful beginning, not only for them, but for all those who had fought so hard for peace. Kalara stood in a flowing gown, her violet skin shimmering in the sunlight. It was a simple dress, made from the finest materials the human colony could provide. But to Ryan, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. She was radiant, not just in her appearance, but in the way she had transformed from a soldier to a beacon of hope. Ryan wore a military uniform, now modified for the occasion. His armor had been discarded in favor of something less practical but far more meaningful. His eyes, however, still carried the weight of the war, the pain of everything they had lost, and the quiet promise to never forget. The ceremony itself was brief, but it didn't need to be long to carry immense weight. The officiator, a human representative of the Peace Council, spoke of love, sacrifice, and the possibility of a future free from the shadows of war. But it was the vows, spoken softly by Ryan and Kalara, that made the moment truly unforgettable. Ryan's voice was steady but filled with emotion. "Kalara, when I found you, you were broken, and so was I. But together, we've rebuilt not only ourselves but the world around us. I promise to stand by you, not just in peace, but in every challenge we face. I'll protect you, love you, and honor you, always." Kalara's voice trembled, but she spoke with conviction. "Ryan, you saved me when I had nothing left. You showed me what love is, and you gave me a future I never thought possible. I promise to stand by your side, to fight for you and for our people. I'll never let go, no matter what comes." When they exchanged rings, simple, handmade bands, the crowd erupted in applause. But it wasn't just the humans who cheered. The Zilari, who had once seen Ryan as an enemy, stood in silence, their faces filled with a mixture of respect and awe. Many of them had come to understand that Kaelura's love for Ryan was not a betrayal, but a sign of hope for their future. But even in the midst of celebration, Ryan and Kaelura knew the peace they had fought so hard for was fragile. There were still factions within the Zilari Dominion who viewed their love as a threat. Those who believed that peace was an illusion and that humanity's rise was a challenge to their power. That night, as the stars twinkled overhead, Ryan and Kaelura sat together on a balcony overlooking the colony. The laughter from the wedding reception faded into the background as they shared a quiet moment. "Do you think they'll ever accept us?" Kaelura asked softly, her head resting on Ryan's shoulder. Ryan didn't hesitate. "We've already proven them wrong, haven't we? We survived the worst, Kaelura. We fought when everyone told us we couldn't, and we're still here. And as long as we're together, we'll keep fighting, not just for us, but for everyone who believes in a better world." She nodded, her eyes glimmering with determination. "I'm not afraid of what comes next, Ryan. Not when I have you." Ryan kissed the top of her head, his heart swelling with love. "And I'll never let you go. We'll face whatever comes, side by side." The following days were filled with both celebration and tension. There were moments of laughter, of quiet conversations with friends who had become family, but there were also hushed discussions in private rooms, warnings from diplomats, and threats from those who didn't believe in the new world they were trying to build. Ryan and Kaelura knew that their journey wasn't over. They had fought for survival, for peace, and now they would fight for the future they had promised to each other. The first sign of trouble came sooner than they had expected. A group of Zilari extremists, still loyal to the war-hungry leaders of the Dominion, began to stir unrest in the outer colonies. They believed that by disrupting the fragile peace, they could force the Zilari people back into war. Their message was clear. The alliance with humanity was a betrayal, and Kaelura's marriage to Ryan was an insult to their honor. Ryan and Kaelura knew this was coming. They had hoped for peace, but they were prepared for the fight that still loomed. They spent hours in discussions, strategizing with military leaders and diplomats, trying to figure out how to combat the growing threat without plunging their worlds back into war. The first skirmishes were small, a few attacks on human convoys and a few scattered raids in the outer colonies. But it didn't take long for the situation to escalate. Ryan, now fully recovered from his injuries, was once again called to the front lines. He and Kaelura stood together, ready to face whatever dangers lay ahead. But this time, they were not alone. The peace they had fought for was not just a dream of two people, it was a dream shared by many. And as they stood at the forefront of that struggle, they were surrounded by allies, humans and Zilari who had come to believe in the vision of a united future. One evening, as they prepared for another battle, Kaelura turned to Ryan with a look of determination. "We'll make it through this. We have to." Ryan kissed her forehead, his eyes filled with a promise. "We will. We've come this far, Kaelura, and we're not going back." The battle that followed was fierce, but it wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about the future of both their peoples. Every victory, every small triumph, brought them one step closer to the peace they had dreamed of. When the final battle was won, and the last of the extremist forces had been defeated, Ryan and Kaelura stood on the battlefield, not as conquerors, but as symbols of the hope that had led them through the darkest of times. As they looked toward the stars, hand in hand, they knew that their story was far from over. They had won this fight, but there would always be challenges ahead. Together, they would face them, as partners, as warriors, and as a symbol of what love could achieve. And so, as the dawn of a new era broke, Ryan and Kaelura stood ready. Their love had carried them through the worst of times, and it would carry them through whatever lay ahead. Together, they had built a future worth fighting for, and they would protect it, no matter the cost. Their story was only just beginning.